Hello and welcome to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we rank world leaders. I'm joined today by Rory Taylor.
Hello.
Zach Michaelis.
Hello.
And Georgina Finley.
Hello.
How are you all doing?
Very good.
Yeah.
Very
Well,
good to
thanks.
see you're back with us.
Yeah.
Doing well.
In more ways than one.
Yeah, very well, doing very well. I mean, I've been away for the last couple of weeks, so I'm really not plugged into the news. So it'll be good to hear what's been going
We'll
on.
educate you, hopefully.
Yes, exactly. So in the podcast, we're going to start with the losers of the week. We're going to move on to the audience suggestion, the winners of the week, and then finish with the infamous mechanism. Okay, so let's start with the losers of the week. Zach, who is your loser?
My loser of the week, and this is not particularly on brand for me, is French President Emmanuel Macron. And I hate to do this to Manu, but I think that there's sort of two reasons he's going down. The first is that his Prime Minister, Francois Bayrou, according to the most recent polls, has hit a new record low in unpopularity. And that is quite something given how unpopular French leaders and especially French prime ministers have been over the past couple of years. He has a net approval rating of something like minus 60. And there are quite a lot of rumours that he's going to be either forced out or step down, and possibly even paving the way for yet more elections in France. And we know how well the last ones turned out for Macron. The other reason is that in part because of all this political turmoil and the fact that Bayrou proposed a sort of quite austere budget, which hit the headlines because it included scrapping 2 public holidays as a way to sort of boost French GDP. The bond markets have got a little bit jittery. They essentially just think that France there's no political will to make the sort of reforms required to pay off its massive debt burden, which now stands about over 100% of GDP, and it's running an annual deficit about 5 or 6% of GDP, and that's before you're even talking about the increase in military spending that Macron has signed up to. And for the first time in at least 20 years, basically the interest that France has to pay to borrow is now higher than that of Italy. So again, would have been unimaginable, let's say 10 years ago, right? During the Eurozone crisis, when Italy was sort of the famous fiscal basket case of Europe, and France was sort of in between Italy and Germany, but, you know, at least it was sort of like a strong functioning economy. No one would have thought France would need a bailout. And we've sort of switched places. You know, France really does look like it just, there's no space to make any of the reforms required to balance the French books. And Macron just sort of seems stuck. He seems at a similar impasse to where he was before he called the last legislative elections, except for this time, we know that calling snap elections won't work either.
So Bayrou's deeply unpopular. That's the sort of thing here. Do you think he will survive as Prime Minister?
I mean, it's hard to say. So there's a parliamentary break for the next couple of weeks, maybe in two months. Is that how long is it?
It's just a summer recess, so maybe September.
And he will be hoping that, I think the best way of looking at it is that this quite sort of like headline grabbing, very austere budget is sort of like his opening gambit. And I think his plan is to offer up a few concessions to more centrist parties, and especially the socialists, who basically threw him a lifeline at the start of this year, in the hope of sort of bringing them back on side. The one thing I would point out, though, is that the budget that he's proposing, and again, this is the one that everyone said was way too austere to pass. No one likes it. That would only take the French deficit down to about 4.5-5% of GDP in the next couple of years, right? And again, it's worth noting that the EU stated target is 3% of GDP. That is a really, really steep budget deficit, and it's not sustainable in the long term. And it's, in that sense, it's not as ambitious as Barnier's budget. So Barnier's budget basically tried to put the budget down to more deficit to more like 4% of GDP, right? So even if Bayrou can get the socialists on side, that will probably involve offering some sort of concessions, right? And that actually means that the budget will probably only end up, maybe 5 and a bit % of GDP in a couple of years' time. That is still massive. And that is all assuming that the sort of French budget office's forecasts are on track. And historically, they haven't been. One of the issues, right? The reason that France is in such a mess is that the budget office kept on forecasting quite solid growth and not super high interest rates. And then French growth kept on underperforming. So, again, my point here is that even if Bayrou gets this budget through and does survive, which I think is looking less and less likely because it's very, very politically toxic, and I think the socialists won't want to touch it, this doesn't solve the long-term fiscal problem for France or Macron, right? Because Macron obviously has to deal with this in the next couple of years.
Yeah, there just really doesn't seem to be a way out. I don't know what the way out is. And if, a new election, you could either end up with more gridlock or, parliamentary gridlock, or either the far right or the sort of group of the left-wing parties doing better. And then that's definitely not going to help the situation. Yeah, just genuinely can't see a way out.
Well, yeah, and I hate to sound too sort of, I think it's quite like a neoliberal, boring econ take, right? That there are two ways out, in that either, Rory's right, you vote for a party like National Front, National Rally, or La France Insoumise, which is the sort of left-wing coalition, and they try and borrow a whole lot more money, and the bond markets probably go, nah, you're not having this. And then you're in some sort of crisis. And then I think the French electorate will just have to learn that lesson, right? And they can't afford that. The other one is that you get some sort of politician who has the credibility to convince the electorate that they do need to make these reforms before there is some sort of crisis that forces that lesson upon them, right? I think one of the really structural issues here, like almost the fundamental issue here, is that people don't like Macron, and there are no politicians in France currently that are trusted enough to make that argument, right? You do need a politician to who people like, to sell them the idea of austerity, right? In lots of ways. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it sounds like they're going through their sort of UK moment, in that they've got unpopular politicians, sort of, times in UK political history, and not very credible opposition, and bond markets in flux.
I think actually the UK analogy is really good. I think Keir Starmer is in a bit of a similar predicament, right? Because one of the issues at this point, this is what happened very, very early for Starmer, is that no one really trusts him, right? So even if he says like, okay, guys, we need to make these long-term reforms because we need to pay off the debt in the future, he's flip-flopped too much. You don't really trust him to get it through with, his sort of raucous MPs, and backbenchers. No one really believes he's actually going to do it, right? Which means that he can never sort of muster the political momentum or the sort of like goodwill to get through difficult reforms. I mean, the fact that Starmer's in this position already is embarrassing for him, but Macron is in this position because he's been in power for 5 years now, and his popularity has been sort of slowly going down. And it's just very hard when you have a net approval rating of minus 40 or whatever to go, guys, I know I've been in power for 5 years, but the deficit still isn't fixed. You need to trust me. We need to do more miserable things.
You also have a load of political figures in France just looking at the clock, thinking we're nearly at 2027. Just count it down, keep things sort of on ice, and then jump in. That's
why it's such a deadlock.
Yeah,
and that there's a lot of incentive to stay in opposition now. You don't really want to join the government at this sort of tough time. You want to basically just whack them with a proverbial stick until the next elections come around, and then go, oh no.
Have the National Rally suggested any fixes, or do they just go for the criticism?
There are individual policies that sort of float around, and quite a lot of them revolve around like cutting various forms of benefits to immigrants. But when it actually comes, you look at the sort of whole policy package. I don't know when the last proper analysis was done. I mean, but at the last election, when they produced their manifesto, all of the independent watchdogs said, sure, you've sort of got some token cost-cutting measures in here, but in the aggregate, this is require loads more borrowing, right? And that's in part because like quite a lot of, let's just say like hard right / far right parties, as part of their program to I don't know, moderate their appeal, to sort of move to the political center, they've started focusing on like the cost of living, right? I think you sort of see that again in the UK with Farage moving left on certain economic issues. And again, and Farage is a good analogy in that like, if you sort of add up all his promises, it would require a massive increase in borrowing, right? Because he's got that odd combination of like, right-wing tax cuts, but then also as part of this pivot to the sort of proverbial center, a whole load of spending increases to make
his
him more
party's
appealing.
constantly having arguments with economists over it as well.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's a really good, I mean, the UK France analogy, as much as we hate to admit it, we are very similar countries the whole time, and especially
I think
at the moment.
both countries would probably hate to admit that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, on that, let's move on. And Georgina, who is your loser of the week?
My loser this week is also a big European figure. It's the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. And this is because Ursula von der Leyen's team proposed this nearly €2 trillion budget for 2028 to 2034, which upon its unveiling caused a lot of consternation and opposition from various different groups, for political reasons and also economic reasons. And from what I remember, the coverage last week, there were three overarching problems that people had with this proposed budget. Firstly was the cost of it, because it's a record size budget, 1.8 trillion euros. And this would require a lot of spending from national governments, which are already facing, as we've just discussed with Macron in France, huge budget deficits and domestic problems with balancing their books. And so they don't necessarily want to have to contribute more to this massive budget. So that's the first set of complaints. The second set of complaints were to do with the redistribution of funds to different parts of the economy. So some of these will be popular with particularly member states, I think. Like there's a 5-fold increase in defense spending, there's a 3-fold increase in border security and migration, and there's a doubling of research funding. But this has come largely at the expense of the agricultural industry, with a significant cut in the common agricultural policy budget from, I think, 380 million euros to about 300 million euros. So this has, again, reignited a long-running debate between Brussels and the farmers, which, as we know from protests we've seen in the past couple of years, have caused the EU to backtrack on some of its promises in the past. And then the third set of issues around this budget were the way that it was developed. And so supposedly it was drafted very much behind closed doors with just a few members of Ursula von der Leyen's team. It was very centralized. And this also annoyed a lot of people because, this is going to have to go through the EU Parliament and be debated over the next few years. And the fact that this was all done supposedly in a very secretive fashion has also annoyed a lot of people and kind of reignited a debate again about the centralization of power in Brussels.
Yeah, so she now moves to the second lowest spot, which is, it's a swift move down the board. But I suppose the last 2 weeks, if we've had a vote of no confidence and a sort of debate about her budget, it seems more than fair that she's sort of moving down the way that she is. Zach and Rory, have you got anything to add to this?
I can.
I do as well, but I saw you writing, so I thought you might want to.
I do, but you go first.
Okay, sure.
How very British.
Yeah. Yes, she really in the last few months has been on a bit of a downfall from Queen of Europe moment to much less solid in her position. But yeah, the fact there were some leading MEPs who came out to say this budget is not enough to do what we want to do on our priorities. Then you've got countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and others saying this is far too big. It really just goes to show how there's criticism of it basically from every side. But I think the point Georgina made about, I think it was the third reason that people were unhappy, is the way in which it was sort of put together, drafted and announced bodes really poorly for the years of negotiations that now have to happen. Because if she continues with that approach, member states aren't going to engage very constructively with her. The European Parliament's going to be frustrated with her. I think she's made her already difficult job a lot more difficult by going about it this way. Yeah, that's what I was going to add.
I'm this is slightly off key here, but I'm going to defend Ursula von der Leyen. I think I think fundamentally she just has a really difficult job, right? Yeah. And I think that the way she went about negotiating this budget is in some sense a reaction to that fact, in that she knew that if she did this all very publicly and, sort of invited consultations from all the various sectors and lobbies, you would never have even got to a first draft. There are too many demands on the European budget. We want massive farmer subsidies. We want an energy transition, which turns out is getting more and more expensive every year. We want massive military spending as well, because we now got to reduce our reliance on the US. We also, I think this is sort of post-pandemic, we also expect the EU to act as a sort of like crisis manager, right, to step in and provide funding in times of crisis. So you have all these demands, and then as Georgina articulated, no one wants to spend any more money. No one wants to give any more money to Brussels. So she's just in this sort of like slightly impossible spot. And I think it's been made even more impossible by the fact that there is a sort of renewed opposition to any new EU-led taxes, right? The only way for von der Leyen to close this gap between the sort of expectations and the actual funding commitments that the EU member states are willing to make is via borrowing in the short term, which is why we are seeing a massive increase in EU issued debt. So as part of this new budget, she's also talking about borrowing another 400 billion euros just in case for various crises. Again, that going back to that pandemic funding, I think it's a sort of like rejigged version of that. And eventually you have to pay off that borrowing. No one knows how they're going to do it. And so every so often, von der Leyen sort of flirts with this new, maybe we'll try a sort of funky tax here. You know, the EU is setting tariffs at the moment. It might set some pretty massive tariffs in response to Trump. That might provide some new funding. They're sort of hoping. And in the most recent budget, she was talking about a tax on massive European companies. So the biggest companies operating in Europe, sort of like EU-led tax. I think that's quite a politically savvy thing to do, right? You need money. You know, what is the sort of like the politically easiest way to get that money? You ask the really, really big corporations. That's something that everyone can agree on. But once again, member states have gone, oh, that feels like an infringement of sovereignty. I want to be the one taxing my big companies, not you. And so now she's stuck. And I just think that there's this fundamental impasse, right? If you're not willing to cede any further taxation or revenue raising powers to Brussels, but at the same time you want it to do, you know, all these massive international, whether sort of like continental size, you know, to address the continental challenges, what's the solution here? In lots of ways, it's not dissimilar to the Macron predicament we were talking about, right? In that, like, Brussels just doesn't have the political credibility to explain why it needs either more money from member states, tax raising powers, or to cut spending.
So yeah, I feel like the argument there is essentially that it's trying to treat itself more as like a superpower. But there's still the national governments that are unwilling to cede that sort of that power upwards to Brussels, and that is ultimately where this comes from. I feel like it's a very valid defense of von der Leyen there.
But it's also because, like, it's partly that, but it is also that, like, everyone still expects the EU to do lots, right? They don't want to see sovereignty, but they still expect it to do all these really difficult things.
And basically do more and more each year, it seems.
And the EU, I mean, von der Leyen is, you know, she's invited some of that herself. She likes to play the Queen of Europe, and then obviously if you act the Queen of Europe, everyone all of a sudden expects you to dole out some cash. But I still am sympathetic to her plight. I think that there is that slightly schizophrenic attitude from member states that they want the EU to fix lots of the big continental problems, but they are unwilling to spend money.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, sort of uncharacteristic moving Macron down in defense of von der Leyen.
Yeah, true, actually. What's happened to him?
I don't even know what to make of that. But we'll before I even try, we'll move on and go to Rory. Who is your loser of the week?
My loser of the week is Shigeru Ishiba, the Prime Minister of Japan. And this is for a classic World Leaderboard movement reason. He lost an election on Sunday. So it's a very logical move, I think. His LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, lost its coalition majority in the upper house, which is the House of Councillors in Japan, which means that the LDP and its partner Komeito no longer have a majority in either house. So his already difficult job is a lot worse. Right-leaning party, even though the LDP is a conservative party, parties generally to the right of the LDP did well at this election. You've got the Democratic Party for the People did well, which is a sort of populist right-wing party, and Sanseito, which is what you might call a far-right party that's sort of not come out of nowhere, but it's really quite a sudden surge in recent weeks and months. We did a video about it and also about the election overall, sort of attacking the LDP from the right on things like immigration, like social issues, because Ishiba is from the more liberal wing of the LDP. But yeah, very bad news for him. But he has said he wants to stay on, so he's not. There was a lot of talk that this result might mean he resigns or is forced to resign, but he has indicated he wants to stay on. He might be safe for now, given that Japan is, like many countries, trying to strike a trade deal with the US, and different factions within his party might think, well, look, let's try and get this trade deal done. We don't want a political vacuum when this needs sorting out. But at the end of the day, he's been prime minister for 9 months now, I think, and he's faced 2 consecutive elections in those 9 months and lost his party's majority in both houses, which is possibly an unprecedented sort of bad record.
No, I think it's never happened before.
Yeah. So, you know, staying on in the long term seems really difficult given that fact. And the right wing in his party, who he narrowly beat to become the party's leader last year, will probably be looking at these results and saying, look, parties to the right of us did really well. We can't keep electing these liberal leaders, and we've got to swing right and take them on. And yeah, they may well choose to strike later down the line, but I think it probably is inevitable.
I mean, as you say, if you lose an election, I think it's fair to expect to move down on the board.
Yeah.
I think the surprising thing is, despite all that you've explained, I mean, Zach, you saying that this is sort of unprecedented, he's only second from the bottom. So Starmer is, according to our board, still having a worse time.
Yeah.
But that aside, I think that's more than reasonable. Zach, do you have anything to add to this? I know that it seems like you're
scribbling away.
Yeah.
The only thing I think it's worth, you just had to stress that it was an appalling result. The LDP got, I mean, the polls a couple of days ago were saying they would cling on to their majority. And not only did they not get that they got to like 21% of the national vote. And this is a party that used to poll around 50% for most of the most of the late 20th century, and was still polling well above 30% before Kishida, basically. But yeah, I think the one silver lining for Ishaba is that things are going so badly that who would want to take over? You know what I mean? He might benefit from that sort of like stasis.
And also, I mean, this is how the LDP has managed to do so well over many, many years. The fact that even though opposition parties have surged, it's always new and different opposition parties surging relative to each other. And they're just the main opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, sort of centre-leftish, didn't do very well at this election. And they're the only viable ones who could lead another government, really. So the LDP sort of manages to struggle onwards because of that, I think, which isn't great for governance, I suppose, but it means the LDP can sort of extend their record in power.
Historically, and they haven't done it for a while, but historically they've also been very good at folding in upstart opposition parties, and they basically just take their charismatic leader and turn them into an LDP MP. Although I think you're getting to the point now where they're really quite unpopular, to the point that I don't know if they could plausibly do that, right? Like if you're Camilla, who's the guy who leads Sansato, and the LDP went, come join us, you might be like, no, you're not.
We're doing better.
Yeah, we're doing better.
Yeah.
We don't need that. And I think that's a dangerous turning point, right? It's like being, one of those massive tech companies. It's great when you can just buy every other upstart. But if at a certain point, everyone's like, actually, I think I'll do better without you, then you sort of hit a doom loop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we move on to the audience suggestion, we've just finished writing and editing the latest edition of our magazine, Too Long. This one is on the end of the American order, which is something that we discuss on the podcast quite a lot. So if you're watching this, this is almost certainly an edition that you're going to want to read. I know that we've all written articles in this that we're all quite proud of. So Georgina, is there a particular article that you've either read or written that you're quite proud of?
Either read or written.
I think we do actually have an answer to this, by the way.
Okay,
we were all, I mean, she's not here, but I think we all agreed that we were very impressed by Naja's offshoring article.
I've already used that on the podcast, to be fair.
Have you?
But
you can carry it.
There's
There's no reason not to shout out again.
No, you go. Why did you like it?
I actually liked it because I think it's, I think one of the most interesting things about it is it's like lots of politics feels like it's reverting back to maybe a sort of like pre-modern time. I don't mean to sound too pretentious, but like this whole spheres of influence thing about Trump, right? And like the disdain for international law. I think what Naja's talking about really fits into that, right? In that like offshoring, the archetypal case of offshoring was us when we sent criminals to Australia, right? Long time ago. I don't have a precise date. But it's quite interesting that we are sort of like, and then, for a few hundred years, we thought that's barbaric. We don't, these are British citizens. We don't just send people away. And now we are sort of reverting back to, I think, that sort of style of politics in lots of ways, that like, it's a problem, we're just going to chuck it some other country and they can deal with it. And I know that people who defend that sort of policy, and I'm not saying, I don't think the policies that currently been implemented are anywhere near as severe as the Australia thing, but I think you do see at least some politicians flirting with more and more extreme forms of offshoring, right? You start off with Rwanda, and then you start maybe El Salvador is a more extreme version of Rwanda, obviously, because it's not asylum processing, that's just putting people in massive illegal jail, basically. And then, you see Trump talking about maybe doing it with homegrowns, right? And you do see this sort of like slippage towards that sort of politics where like a problem can be solved by just chucking it to some other territory, which is a pretty crazy sort of politics. It's pretty lawless.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it shows that even in a promo, you're never safe from a Zach monologue. So that's great. But if you do want to read,
you, and that's how you repay me.
yeah, if you do want to read that, you can find that in our latest edition of the magazine. And if you want to buy it, we've got an offer at the minute. Best offer. If you use that code on the website, you'll get 35% off. And that's on top of the 20% off that you get from subscribing. So that brings the total savings to 48% and brings the cost as low as £5.20. So if you use code BESTOFFER, you can get quite a big discount. Okay, so we will move on and get to the audience suggestion. So the audience suggestion this week is Cyril Ramaphosa. Does anyone want to start?
I would happily start. It's a very good audience suggestion. We also released a video about Cyril Ramaphosa's struggles in government just a few days ago, so it's good timing. I'm going to suggest that we move him down, which I think would move him to the very bottom rung. He many reasons why he's having a difficult time, but the main thing at the moment is his police minister, who is an ally of his, is embroiled in this big scandal, alleged to be involved in quite highly corrupt dealings, including interfering in investigations into like politically motivated killings, things that serious. Ramaphosa has tried to deal with that by, I think he suspended him from being minister and also ordered a judicial investigation into it. But it hasn't really pleased that many people for various reasons. A lot of people think these inquiries sort of just drag on and don't really bring anyone to account. And yeah, it's a corruption scandal that the ANC, Ramaphosa's party, doesn't need because they've suffered with some corruption issues going back a few years. And he came to power sort of as an anti-corruption guy, and it sort of paints the picture that maybe he hasn't been as good at dealing with it as people might have hoped. So yeah, he's a loser for me, even though I do think the coalition that he's in, as much as it looks like they really don't get on, it does have a knack for staying in power and not falling apart. And I think that probably will be the outcome of this, even if it is bad news for him.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly doesn't sound great. Zach and Georgina, do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree. The last thing I'll say is that I think Roy mentioned Ramaphosa when he came to power. There was a lot of optimism about Ramaphosa as a sort of like business savvy, anti-corruption figure. And I think it goes to show there's a slightly depressing reality that in lots of ways, I think no matter your intentions, when you take over a party of like the size of the ANC and also with the depths of its problems, there's only so much you can do at the end of the day, right? Like one man can't turn around what looks like quite a broken organization all by himself.
Yeah. Well, with that moves him to the bottom rung of the leaderboard. So we'll move on and we'll go to the winners of the week. So we'll start with Zach. Who's your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is already at the top of the board, but it is Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa. And I think intuitively, you might be tempted to move him down. I mean, over the past week or so, there was a sort of outbreak of sectarian violence in the sort of south of Syria between Bedouin tribes and the Druze people who live concentrated around the city of Suwaida. They have been sort of recurring interethnic tensions between those two groups for many, many years, but it sort of like broke out into a full-fledged armed conflict last week, the start of last week, or maybe even Sunday, actually. But then, and then when al-Sharaa tried to send in sort of his national troops to stem the violence, that invited airstrikes from Israel, who claimed that he was, his forces were going to sort of abuse the rights of the Druze minority. Israel has its own Druze minority, so that the Druze are sort of spread around Lebanon, to a lesser extent Jordan, Israel, southern Syria. And I think in lots of ways you might think, oh, that's a terrible week for al-Sharaa. And I guess in some sense it is, but I think there are two reasons that it's actually turned out all right from the first, is that it looks like America basically intervened on his side, right? America's the only person who could have, Trump is the only person who could have stopped Israel from striking Syria. And it does look like he basically did say, look, enough is enough. We need to try and keep the nascent Syrian state stable. And the other reason is that actually in the sort of ceasefire that was agreed and signed off by the majority of Druze leaders, not only did the Druze leaders say that Syrian national forces can come into southern Syria, which they hadn't done beforehand to try and basically keep the peace, but also they committed to folding Suwaida, al-Suwaida is actually the governor, into sort of Syria's national institutions, right? So from al-Sharaa's perspective, that's a pretty good outcome. You know, that basically does pave the way for basically national integration.
Well, when you started that, I was wondering what the second part was, because that's a pretty hellish start to the week.
Yeah, but I think you're right.
Clearly, Trump intervening there was quite a big moment for Syria.
And I think he's the guy who did charm Trump. That was the other thing where Trump came away and said he's very young, very handsome.
Yeah.
And so that's apparently enough.
Well, that's the important part, isn't it? That's how world politics works
imagine
these
how
days.
frustrated you'd be if you were Netanyahu. It's just that he's not a bad-looking chap, and that's stopped you from annexing a bit more of Syria.
Yeah. Rory, I know that you sometimes write things on Syria, so you'll probably have opinions on this.
Yeah, Zach summed up very well. I was going to add that I think Israel's sort of gung-ho strikes on Syria and intervention will probably also mean Erdogan in Turkey will think I've really got to even get more involved, because he's very involved already in support of al-Sharaa, which is probably good news for al-Sharaa to.
I also think it would have cemented a sense of national unity in amongst most of Syria, right? And actually, probably most Druze. Again, there's no like reliable polling. It's very hard to know what like Druze public opinion is, but. According to the well-versed analysts, there does seem to be sort of after this violence, a sense in the Druze that they do need to intervene.
The Israeli airstrikes were just so much more than what they'd been previously. It wasn't just in pockets of weapon storage and whatever. It was like they bombed the entrance to the Ministry of Defense. They bombed right around the presidential palace. Like you saw these videos, and it was really, really dramatic,
pretty terrifying. Yeah. And also those places were sort of Damascus. It's like a functioning normal city now, right? It's not like the first couple of airstrikes were on like Syrian tank convoys, right? Which is sort of that's you see that on the internet, airstrikes striking tanks, and then the second wave, as Rory was saying, it's just on like bits of central Damascus where there were just sort of like cars going around roundabouts, and then like the whole palace blows up behind them. So I think that would have sort of cemented a sense of national unity in Syria.
Yeah.
Those images.
Yeah.
Can I disagree with the movement?
Yeah, I'd like you to.
Because people like disagreement on the podcast, don't they? Yeah. We had a bit of dialogue about this before we settled on who we were going to move today. Because I wanted to move al-Sharaa down for the reasons that Zach set out. And I think your point about Trump, supposedly intervening, at least telling the Israelis that you've got to stop striking. I think the US told Israel to stop striking, and then on Wednesday last week, and then Israel launched another strike on Suwaida on Thursday anyway. So it's not like Netanyahu listened. And I think the reason this bodes badly for me is that al-Sharaa came in trying to be claiming that he was going to be a unifying president of the whole of Syria, including the Druze religious minority. But actually what I think Israel has, I would say, successfully done is exploited these sectarian tensions that were pre-existing so early on in Shara's tenure to effectively show the world, look, this leader that you all thought was going to come in and be fairly liberal and have control of the country, and he's just signed these, got this sanctions deal with the US. And, there was a lot of talk in the press about hope for Syria and the future for Syria. It actually has exposed how deep these problems are, because the clashes that we've been seeing in Suwaida in the south aren't, Syrian government forces have now withdrawn from the region, but as of today, things have calmed down a bit, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see further clashes in the next few days. And in fact, I think the Bedouin militias have indicated that they would be willing to, restart violence basically if things don't settle down. So I think for me, this past week has been a shift in kind of there was a lot of hope for Syria's rebuilding and future, and now actually, it's really revealed the scale of the challenge ahead for al-Sharaa. And I think what it also has done is really reminded everyone that Israel is still a massive force of chaos and strikes, across various Middle Eastern countries. And the fact that Netanyahu has gone ahead and done this, and also in the past day or so, White House officials have come out and spoken quite harshly about Netanyahu himself. one White House official called him a madman. Another was quoted describing him as a child with, what was it? A child, something like a child who just won't behave. And so there's some signs again that the US is frustrated or exasperated at the fact that Israel will just go ahead and seemingly do what it wants across various countries in the Middle East with very few repercussions.
But isn't that good news for al-Sharaa, the fact that the US is so frustrated with Israel? And also on the sequencing, the strikes were on Wednesday. There was strikes on Tuesday, and then there were comments by, I think, Trump or Rubio saying, we don't like this. And then there were further strikes on Wednesday morning, and then Rubio and a bunch of Arab leaders then stepped in and acted. That's one thing, they actually negotiated the truce. Then there were no more Israeli strikes. But isn't it a good thing that, from al-Sharaa's perspective, that the US is so explicitly frustrated with Israel's Syria policy?
I suppose, but I think the fact that regardless of, I mean, I'm sure Israel would have been aware beforehand that this would be something that the US would have a problem with if they went ahead and did it. But they went ahead and did it anyway. And I don't know, I think it also shows that there is a limit to how much the US can rein in what Israel is doing in various parts of the Middle East. I don't know.
No, I think that's true in other places. But I think that the fact that I guess you're right though, that it depends on how it plays out, right? In that we're annoyingly, as always with this podcast, we're recording it on Monday and it be out on Wednesday, and there's a very good chance that by then something more will have kicked off. And it is worth saying that the Israelis said you have 2 days, you can send national forces in for 2 days, and if you haven't sorted it out by then, we reserve the right to resume strikes. So it does depend on how things progress. But I think the point that I think is very, very fair is that it does remind everyone of the scale of the challenge, right? And that I think you're right. Al-Sharaa sort of presents himself as, he's going on the West's politics and wearing a suit and all that sort of thing. And I think he might be reformed, but the sectarian tensions plus the very credible reports of actually some pretty appalling human rights abuses against the Druze do remind everyone of the fact that, fundamentally his army is a hodgepodge of Islamist militias. And even if he's read, a whole load of modern economics books about how to found a state, doesn't mean they necessarily have. And he's got this permanent challenge on his hand, right? Yeah. Which is to try and rein in the more rogue elements of his army.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll move on and we'll go to Georgina. Who is your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is someone who hasn't moved on our board for 26 weeks. Whoa. So he's getting his first movement, and this is Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro. And he's going up actually for some possibly controversial reasons, but this is a good chance for us to talk about this prisoner swap, this prisoner exchange that has occurred in recent days between 3 countries. And the interesting thing is that all 3 countries are claiming this deal as a win in some regard. So the 3 countries in question are the US, Venezuela, and El Salvador. And as some of our viewers might know, in March, 252 Venezuelan nationals were deported to El Salvador by the Trump administration, accused of having links with the notorious Tren de Aragua gang in Venezuela. And El Salvador's president, Bukele, has cultivated a very warm relationship with Trump. And there's this massive terrorism confinement center, or SECOT, I think it's known as, in El Salvador, where these men are have been held for the past few months. And what's happened in the past few days is there's been a deal struck, and I phrase it as such because it's unclear actually who was responsible for brokering the deal, and how it's being sold in different ways to each of the 3 countries' different populations. Anyway, a deal between the US and Venezuela to exchange these 252 Venezuelan nationals for 10 US nationals being held in Venezuela as political prisoners, I think is the phrase that's being used. And Maduro, I think, previously has resisted. I think early this year there was a flight of Venezuelan nationals or Latin Americans that Trump wanted to deport to Venezuela, and Maduro refused. But he hasn't kicked off about this. And in fact, the reception of these men back to Venezuela has been met with celebration from family members who haven't seen their sons in months or years in some cases. And so the Maduro government is trying to claim this as a win. In fact, they use the term, Venezuela's interior minister used the term, accused Bukele of kidnapping the men that were being held in this prison. And Maduro himself said, "We went to retrieve them from the concentration camps and have brought them back safe and sound." So that's how the Venezuelan government is portraying this deal. Then on the US side, you've got the Trump administration celebrating this as a success because they brought home 10 US citizens that were being held in Venezuela. And then you've got Bukele in the middle, who's basically claiming credit on all sides for both locking up the alleged criminals and the alleged gang members, which is something Bukele himself has also reiterated these accusations, and also, you know, trying to portray himself as the country that's brokered this deal. But again, you've got very mixed messaging because the Venezuelan government said that Bukele had nothing to do with this deal at all, and accused him of trying to sabotage it, in fact, by impeding the takeoff of the flights. So we've got three sets of different messages coming out of these three governments, and it's hard to know what the actual state of things was. But in any regard, Maduro is claiming this as a success.
I think Maduro, there's also a win for Maduro in the sense that he is diplomatically engaged with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
When you think about some members of the Trump administration in the past, they were effectively calling for regime change in Venezuela and Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Venezuela.
Yeah.
It sort of looks like that's far in the past now, and Trump is basically just treating Maduro as like another leader to do deals with. So I think Maduro's sort of the isolation that he had faced is definitely weakening.
Yeah.
And that's especially compared to Biden, right? Because Biden was into that whole democracies versus autocracies thing. And then after the Venezuelan threats towards Guyana, he imposed a whole lot of very big sanctions. Although they were wound down to try and get more oil on the market, but that's not relevant. That's a different story.
Yeah, fair enough.
I have one more thing to add,
Yeah.
which is that this is also interesting just to look at the US side of what happened here, because supposedly there were two different deals two different offers put forward to Venezuela by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and by the Special Envoy, Grenell. Is it Mark Grenell? Richard Grenell. And Richard Grenell wanted to allow Venezuela to continue its trade relationship with the oil giant Chevron, which is not something that I think Trump or Rubio wanted. And ultimately it was Rubio's offer that was accepted. But this, again, reports say that there was a lot of confusion within the Trump administration at the time that this was being negotiated, because there were two different offers and it was all a bit chaotic.
It's kind of scary to think about the fact that if you look at the flow of people in that deal, you've basically got a system where the Trump administration can round up very spuriously people it accuses of being gang members, ships them off to El Salvador where they disappear for a bit. El Salvador can ship those people off to Venezuela. Venezuela can send some Americans back to America. And it's just this very murky, like, transfer of people around that I don't know if this becomes a regular thing.
It's a bit like what Zach was saying before, and off Nadja's penal colonies article. Like, you know, we're living in a time where governments can just ship people off to another country who will, as you say, stow them away for a bit, ship them off to another country, and then you've got an exchange, and it's like,
you can't trust any of the three governments involved in the deal. That's one of the reasons you can't figure out what's going on. Is that who do you trust less? Trump, Trump, Bukele, or Maduro?
It's not a great set of people. Fair enough. Right, we will move on and we'll end with Rory's winner of the week.
Very excitingly, my winner of the week is a new addition to the board and a new hat on the board, which the audience will be excited about.
Maybe the best hat.
Yeah, quite possibly. So my winner is Asim Munir, who is the Chief of Staff of the army in Pakistan. He is... I was going to use the phrase de facto leader. I don't know if that's really fair. He's definitely the most powerful man in Pakistan. Pakistan does have a parliament and a prime minister, but the military holds significant sway, and he is the big man in the military. He just got promoted to field marshal, and he's the second person ever to be promoted to field marshal. But the reason why I'm making him my winner of the week is that the relationship between Donald Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi looks like it's getting weaker and weaker, while Trump has been buddying up to Munir a bit in recent weeks and months. This comes after the 4-day war between India and Pakistan in May, I think it was. Munir came out of that a lot stronger. Both India and Pakistan claim they won the war, but within Pakistan, Munir and the army's popularity sort of surged after that. And there was a bit of a war of narratives between, actually India and the US. Trump was claiming that it was US intervention by threatening, trade-related sort of repercussions that brought the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. India is saying it was bilateral, just India and Pakistan. We agreed to have a ceasefire. The US wasn't actually involved. So that's been the sort of cause of tension between Trump and Modi. And Trump, again, just a few days ago, reiterated that point that he was saying, we created the ceasefire. And he also sort of backed up this Pakistani claim of downing 5 Indian jets during that conflict, which is another claim that India has denied. So Trump seems to be siding with the sort of Pakistani narrative versus the Indian one. And Munir himself actually got hosted for a lunch at the White House with Trump at the end of June, I think. And that was the first time ever that a Pakistani military chief was hosted by a US president without the presence of other Pakistani civilian government officials, which suggests that Trump views him as the leader and the one to do business with. That obviously bolsters Munir's position at home. If people in Pakistan are looking at him being treated like that by Trump, they'll think, he is the man in charge. And this comes after consecutive presidential terms under both Trump and Biden, where US-Pakistan relations sort of languished a bit, whereas now this really seems to have turned around with Trump 2.0, and Pakistan is definitely jumping on that as an opportunity. They've nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize, which he was very grateful for, although he's fighting off nominations from Israel and other people, I guess. But yeah, he's just come out of the last few months a lot stronger, and I think he's a interesting person to have on the board.
I mean, winning over Trump seems like a...
Yeah, it's the thing to get you moved on the board these days.
Exactly, yeah. Zach, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think this is a very good choice.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one. I'm surprised we don't have the Pakistani leader on the board yet. I do think it's funny that Trump does just seem to claim credit for every conceivable peace deal, even ones he just has nothing to do with. Yeah. The Ethiopian one, in that tweet that he claimed them, I mean, he couldn't have had less to do with it, and there's no peace deal. He claimed he'd negotiated a peace deal over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and he's like 3 years too late for starters between Egypt and Ethiopia, and there's no deal. I don't know what he's referencing. I don't know how he thought he did it. One other thing that I think is really interesting is that on the whole jets fiasco, he has sided with the Pakistanis. He's backed up their claim, saying that they did shoot down jets. That is a very weird claim for Trump to back up, given that they are American jets. They're American F-15s that were shot down with Chinese hardware. They've caused it actually caused a massive spike in Chinese military stocks, that conflict, because everyone saw that Chinese military kit can take down F-15s and apparently really easily, which is pretty terrifying, by the way, guys. When we all get conscripted into Taiwan at Keir Starmer's beck, and we're going to be destroyed. But yeah.
Such a bleak side note to then return back to the point.
The other reason, by the way, I think you should go up on the board, and this is something that's not really talked about, is a couple of years ago, we did a load of videos about Pakistan's economic crisis. The Pakistan economy has always been a mess. Loads of IMF bailouts, which it's pretty much an open secret. The reason the IMF bails out Pakistan the whole time is because you can't have a nuclear armed power go bankrupt. But a lot of that was to do with energy, right? It was because after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, massive spike in energy prices, and actually a lot of European countries just buying all of the spare LNG, liquefied natural gas, because we needed it, because we stopped our pipeline gas from Russia. And there were so many literally direct cases where there was a ship going to Pakistan and a European country would say, look, I'll pay you enough to break that contract and just come straight to us. Because Pakistan it's a massive energy importer, right? One of the reasons its economy is always struggling. And that the Pakistani economy has actually come out of that crisis really quite well, and it has a lot to do with solar. The Pakistani economy has incredibly quickly moved from basically sort of hydrocarbon reliance to using loads and loads of basically locally installed solar. And yeah, I think that's a fascinating and really optimistic story for the entire world. Right, there are lots of poor countries that are very unstable because they rely on basically oil imports, and Pakistan sort of is a tentative piece of evidence that you can resolve that tension by basically buying up loads of super cheap Chinese solar units. And it's a reminder of like how important energy is to an economy.
So another reason that he's a winner.
Yeah,
this
I
week.
honestly think it's a massive reason. I think that a lot of the Pakistan's political turmoil can be traced back to economic turmoil. And actually, if Pakistan has a sort of reliable domestic energy supply, one of the issues actually is it has too much energy, so the grid can't cope with that much electricity. Then it should be a lot more stable, right? You can imagine if you run out of oil as a country and you all use oil to, aircon, heat your houses, drive your cars, that's a disaster. If you at least have some domestically secure energy capacity, that's pretty helpful. Yeah, I know it was loud. I don't
Big
know.
slap.
And it wasn't intentional. I just sort of really got a good cup. That's good. I'll end there.
Yeah, you don't want to try and return to the point after that?
No, I don't. No
all
more
good.
slaps.
Okay, well, we'll move on then, and we'll move on to the mechanism. Okay, so your options this week: the losers are Macron, von der Leyen, and Ishaba, and also the audience suggestion Ramaphosa. Okay, so Georgina, who is your loser of the week?
My ultimate loser this week is Shigeru Ishiba.
Zach.
It is also Shigeru Ishiba.
Shigeru Ishiba.
Oh,
sorry. Do you want to say out loud?
So I went for Ramaphosa.
It's always the host.
I know.
He lost an election. Surely.
I know.
Surely.
It's the number
we're
one
actually all
classic
quite
reason to
grumpy, Ben.
go down on the board.
I know. I can tell. I'm also quite sad that
You've
I
ruined
was
our
the one who
fun
ruined
there.
that one. I'm
Say
sorry.
Shiva.
So there's no movement, unfortunately, this week. There's no unanimous agreement because of me. Anyway, we'll move on to the overall winner of the week. So just a reminder, that's al-Sharaa, Maduro, or Munir.
I've gone for the Pakistani military leader Munir.
Zach.
So have I.
And so have I, Asim Munir.
And so have I.
did. Wow.
There we go. Okay, so there is unanimous agreement. So Munir does move up yet again. So he is the ultimate winner of the week. Okay, so I think that's everything. So we'll be back here again next Wednesday. I think there's a different host. I think Jack will be hosting next week. But thank you for joining us, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Ben.
you.
Yeah.
Munir is now the top hat.
Yeah, it's good.